So what it said is, in the case of conflicts with much weaker enemies, the United States must win rapidly and decisively, because otherwise political support will erode. Like, it's not the 1960s any longer, where you can go on for year after year smashing up a country and destroying it and nobody even bats an eyelash. Now, that's the problem they're facing in Iraq. I mean, if it was the 1960s, early 60s, I mean, they'd just send the B-52s and destroy the place and there wouldn't be any problem. But they can't do that anymore. They don't have the options that Kennedy and Johnson had. You have to win rapidly and decisively or else political support disappears. Well, that's a change. I mean, it's not utopia, you know, but it's a significant change. And I agree exactly with what you say. These trajectories are very optimistic. I mean, you've got to make sure they go on.
Do you think there's a link between political Islam and terrorism as the secular fundamentalists, the UK government and the US government would have us believe?
There's not going to be much time to talk about this, but there is some very good work on it. For example, there's a recent book by Mahmoud Mamdani, a Ugandan scholar at Columbia, exactly on this topic, just came out. And what he points out is that what the West calls terrorism is political Islam. I mean, it was secular. It was a secular political movement for a long time, but the secular political movement was just smashed. I mean, it was partly by outside force, partly by internal corruption. I mean, whatever the reason, the secular political Islam just didn't succeed. And people don't just give up hope at that point. They turn to something else. And what they turn to is religious extremist Islam, which indeed was fostered by the same people who destroyed political Islam. So the United States and Britain and others destroyed political Islam by a good deal of violence. It wasn't the only cause, but it was a significant one. And they also fostered the religious fanatic Islam. I mean, the obvious case is Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's not a big secret. Who organized the Islamic jihadis in the 1980s? You know, CIA, British intelligence, Pakistani intelligence. They scoured the world to find the most radical Islamic extremists they could find and brought them to Afghanistan and trained them and armed them and gave them Stinger missiles and the rest of it. The purpose was not to defend Afghanistan, which could have been a legitimate purpose. In fact, doing it probably prolonged the war in Afghanistan, delayed the Russian departure. Russian archives now show the purpose was quite different. It was to bleed the Russians. That's not legitimate. And in fact, they were carrying out terrorist acts inside Russia in the 1980s. Serious ones. It almost led to a war between Russia and Pakistan, which would have been a nuclear war. After they had done their job of bleeding the Russians, the West figured, okay, we'll forget about them. But they didn't go away. You know, they went back to their own countries or other places, and that's what's become the Al-Qaeda style phenomenon. It finally turned against the West for reasons that we know. And it's a form of political Islam. And that's happened in country after country. I mean, take, say, the Israeli-occupied one of the arguments against, part of the Syria Accountability Act, I don't have time to go into it, is the claim that Syria is allowing offices of Hamas and Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, to stay there. Well, where did Hezbollah and Hamas come from? They come from Israel. I mean, Israel created both of them. In the case of Hamas, it did it consciously. I mean, in the occupied territories, Israel was supporting religious extremists in order to undermine the secular PLO, the political Islam. It wasn't even Islam very much. It was a political, secular movement seeking independence for the Palestinians. Well, that was the real threat. Israel preferred secular religious extremists. One of the only, I think maybe the only university in the West Bank that Israel sort of allowed to be funded was the Islamic University. At one point they were busing students from the Islamic University to Birzeit, the secular university, to break up strikes, protests. Where'd Hezbollah come from? Did you ever hear of them before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon? I mean, they're the result of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, backed by the U.S., otherwise they can't do it. It was a vicious invasion. I mean, killed about 20,000 people, destroyed a large part of southern Lebanon, led to resistance, and the resistance ended up being Hezbollah, which drove them out of Lebanon, and is now becoming a kind of political organization in Lebanon. Well, those are the purpose of the invasion of Lebanon. It was pretty open. I mean, it was expressed by the highest political military echelons. The purpose of the invasion of Lebanon was to eliminate PLO efforts at negotiation and political accommodation, which were just becoming embarrassing. It was very hard to fend them off. So they wanted to drive them out of Lebanon so they can forget about it. In fact, it was called by the chief of staff and others, the Lebanon War was called a war for the West Bank. I mean, there's a kind of a pretense in the West that Israel was reacting to PLO, rocket Katyusha bombings of northern Israel and so on. That's complete lies. I mean, total lies. I mean, if you read the Western scholarly literature, what they say is that for a year before the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the border was quiet. Okay, the statement, the border was quiet, is a racist euphemism for the fact that the border was anything but quiet, except that the attacks were coming from south to north. I mean, Israel was bombing Lebanon, it was sinking ships in harbors, it was murdering people and so on, in an effort, increasingly desperate effort, to elicit some Palestinian reaction that could be used as a pretext for an invasion. When they didn't get a pretext, they invaded anyway. That's called the border is quiet, meaning our guys aren't getting killed. But the actual reason was to try to undermine a political, secular, not even, Islamic and Christian movement just calling for Palestinian independence. End result, Hezbollah. In the occupied territories, end result, Hamas. In Iraq, end result, Muqtada al-Sadr. In Algeria, it was the same kind of development. I mean, in Algeria, after the French left Algeria, they didn't go away. I mean, they penetrated the Algerian security services, the government, and so on. And probably they are responsible for a large part of the massive atrocities of the last 10 years. And one result of all of that is Islamic fundamentalist radicalism in Algeria. I mean, this happens all the time, not just in the Islamic world, elsewhere too. And people do not just say, okay, I quit when you destroy some political option. They find some other way. And often the other way is not very pretty. And often it's fostered by those who ultimately suffer from it. So yes, I think political Islam is the right word for it.
Okay, we have one last question. This is a question from Tom Conte. Question is, do you live in hope or despair? What inspires you about Western political activism? And what do you think it's likely today?
Well, first of all, it doesn't matter. I mean, whether you have hope or despair is kind of like a personal matter between you and your wife and children or something, maybe not even that. It just doesn't matter. You do exactly the same thing, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. Okay, so it really doesn't matter. It's a subjective question. But I think there's reason for hope for the reason that he pointed out before. There is a very definite trajectory which is positive. I mean, there's plenty of things that are horrible. We should talk about them. We're not trying to compliment ourselves on how wonderful we are. So you pay attention to what's wrong, try to fix it, and there's plenty. But the fact of the matter is that there's tremendous improvement in the general level of civilization in Western societies. Things that were simply taken for granted not many years ago are now intolerable, literally intolerable. It's not just in international affairs. I mean, take something like domestic abuse, okay? I mean, 30 or 40 years ago, it wasn't even Yeah, that's life. What's there to talk about? So it was not an issue. Now it's a very big issue. And there's protection and understanding and so on. It hasn't gone, hasn't disappeared, but it's a lot better than it was. And the same is true of everything else. Across the board, you know, there's now awareness and understanding of things that were just taken for granted as the way life is. I mean, I don't know this university, but I suspect it's Manchester, but I imagine it's kind of the same as MIT. At my own university. If you walk down the halls at MIT today, it's 50% women, about a third minorities. People are casually dressed, which reflects informal relationships among people without deference to authority and so on. If you'd walk down the same halls 40 years ago, white males, well-dressed, obedient, maybe 2 or 3 women and a couple of thousand people and so on. Well, that's, this is more than symbolism. You know, these are changes in the nature of the society. And those changes are going on. And we can foster them. They mean that today there is a basis for education and organizing that is much more advanced than it was not many years ago. And still plenty of problems, but it's you could start from a higher plane. And there are plenty of opportunities. I mean, just to finish, take something like, say, the World Social Forum. I mean, this is, again, completely unprecedented in history. I mean, there were attempts to develop what were called internationals, but they were very narrow, and they collapsed for reasons you know. This is the first organization which has the prospects, perhaps, of being a genuine international. As I'm sure you know, it's meeting in the South, like it meets in Brazil and India. The reason is because that's where the activism is. These things were initiated in the South, and very successfully. Big popular movements, lots of activism. Finally, the North sort of was drawn in on the periphery. And if you read about, when you read about it, you read, well, it began in Seattle. That's because if 500,000 people demonstrate in India, it didn't happen. But if something happens in a northern city, it happened, you know. So therefore, Seattle is talked about as the beginning. No, it's not. It's the end, you know. But it's important that the northern countries were drawn in. And now there is an international network of activists. It spawned 100,000 people show up of all kind, you know, every imaginable kind of activist you can think of. It's now spawned regional and local social forums all over the place, which have the same general conception of what the world is and where they're going, but are looking at local problems, which is correct. They should be looking at what's right next to them. Those are all very healthy developments. They've never happened before. There's never been anything like them. And it does give a basis for moving on. To say I'm impressed with this college. It's the first, I don't know how many colleges I've talked about over the years, but this is the first one I've ever heard of where it has enough money so that the police can actually tow people who are illegally parked. That's got to be impressive. Well, I was asked to talk, the title I was given, I guess it's the one that's on some handout you have, is the onslaught against freedom and democracy led by the Bush administration reactionaries. It's always nice to have a nice neutral title that makes no presuppositions or assumptions, so that'll work. But and being obedient, that's what I'll talk about, though would have been interesting to, maybe there'll be time later to talk about the main concerns of the anti-corporate clearinghouse, which are, in my view at least, a much greater threat to democracy than the topic I'm going to talk about, which is bad enough. This topic, there can easily, for convenience, break it up into two aspects, the domestic and the international aspects of the assault on freedom and democracy, called the defense of freedom and democracy. The domestic side, the first thing that comes to mind is the recent legislation that's been enacted in the last couple of years and the new additions that are being planned, the main one being the Patriot Act, Patriot 1, which was rammed through very quickly without any scrutiny, exploiting the circumstances immediately after 9/11. And the next one, which isn't passed, though its text was leaked, you've probably seen it, often called Patriot 2. So far, Patriot 2 has been blocked by rather extensive protest. John Ashcroft, as I'm sure you know, had been a couple of weeks ago traveling around the country. Almost surely his intent was to build up support for the Patriot 2 Act, but to his surprise, he found he was greeted with so much protest and opposition about Patriot 1 that he had to spend all of his time trying to defend Patriot 1. And Patriot 2, as far as we know, is still on the back burner, but they'll try to sneak it through in some other fashion. As for Patriot 1, I won't try to review the content of it. I'm sure you know it. Instead of reviewing the content, I'll just quote a comment on it by one of the heroes of Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, and the rest. In his words, the power of the executive to cast a man in prison without formulating any charge known to the law, and particularly to deny him the judgment of his peers, is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist. That actually is a pretty exact description of the content of Patriot 1. The man who wrote the words, George Bush, looks at every morning. He has a bust on his desk of this revered figure given to him by his friend Tony Blair. The man's name is Winston Churchill, and he was warning about abuses of executive power for intelligence and preventive purposes. The year was 1943, when England was facing annihilation at the hands of the most murderous, brutal regime in history. But nonetheless, Churchill warned severely against the odious practices that are the foundations of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist, and that are enacted in Patriot 1 under far less onerous conditions. So Churchill's words place the Bush administration in its proper historical context, as their great hero perceives it, I think quite accurately. The act has been implemented, but there's been so much resistance to it that the implementation so far is against vulnerable, weak people. That's bad enough. Could be a lot worse, but they haven't been able to make it worse. It's been upheld by the courts to a large extent, the lower courts at least, who have agreed with the administration claim that the executive shall have the right to cast a man in prison without formulating any charge known to the law, to deny him the judgment of his peers, in Churchill's words, and to do it indefinitely, without charge, without access to family and lawyers, including American citizens, and at the whim of the executive, last as long as the executive branch agrees, as long as we have an executive that is committed to the policies that are in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist. That's serious enough, but we should also look at it in perspective. I mean, it's not, by far not, the most severe attack on civil liberties by the executive in U.S. history. So, for example, it doesn't begin to compare with what happened during Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare at the end of the First World War, when thousands of people were kicked out of the country, many arrested, labor movement completely smashed, independent thought almost terminated, many people jailed, among them the leading figure in the U.S. labor movement ever, Eugene Debs, also a presidential candidate. He was charged by Woodrow Wilson with having given a talk in which he questioned the nobility of Wilson's war. So he was tossed into jail, and in an exercise of what's called Wilsonian idealism, Wilson refused even to amnesty him a couple of years after the war when there was a general amnesty. Well, we're nowhere near that. I mean, that laid a pall over the next decade and start coming out of it till the middle of the Depression. It's also what's happening now nowhere near as severe as the COINTELPRO operations that were carried out more recently through the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. These were secret operations carried out by the National Political Police, the FBI, which primarily is concerned with crushing political dissent and has been since its origins when it was established during Wilson's Red Scare. These operations were not at all trivial. In part, they were aimed at destroying a legal political party, small, therefore vulnerable, but just as legal as the Democrats or the Republicans, namely the Socialist Workers' Party. Offices were raided by the FBI, files stolen, names distributed in efforts to keep people from gaining employment, various other forms of harassment. It went on to target the women's movement, all the black movements, the entire New Left. Actions went as far as outright political assassination. The most extreme case was an FBI-organized, really Gestapo-style assassination of a black organizer, Fred Hampton. They also killed somebody else, Mark Clark, in a staged attack by the Chicago police under FBI direction. 4 a.m., murdered him in his bed, both of them. And it wasn't trivial by any means. This was exposed at exactly the same time that Watergate was exposed. And the comparison is quite interesting and tells you a lot about the operative values in the educated sectors, the intellectual classes and the society, and the press as well. So if you do a poll and ask how many people have heard of Watergate and how many have heard of COINTELPRO, you know what the answer will be. Watergate was simply a tea party as compared with COINTELPRO. It was triviality. Almost nothing happened. It was bad. It shouldn't have happened, but it should be a minor footnote in the history of repression. However, it was dealt with as if it's destroying the foundations of the Republic, whereas COINTELPRO, which was incomparably more serious. In fact, the actions against the Socialist Workers' Party alone were far more serious than the entire Watergate incident, and that was the least of it.
It was stopped by the courts. Theoretically, it may still be going on, but it was formally terminated by the courts, and it's of no interest to anyone. So what's the difference between COINTELPRO and Watergate? Well, in the case of Watergate, the people who were targeted, nothing ever happened to them, but the people who were targeted were powerful. In fact, the Democratic Party is roughly half the power in the country. And you don't call powerful people bad names. If you do that, you get thrown out of office, which is exactly what happened to Nixon, for nothing. On the other hand, the Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon actions leading all the way to political assassination on Nixon's beat is of no concern to anyone because the people who are targeted aren't powerful people. So therefore you can do anything you like to them. That does tell us a lot about the operative values. And that remains so. That's the way history is written. You read about Watergate, you don't hear about COINTELPRO. Well, COINTELPRO was incomparably worse than what's happening now. And it helps to put it in perspective. Part of the reason is that the society is just more civilized now. As a result of the activism of the 1960s and the aftermath, people just act differently, see things differently, don't accept things they used to accept, which is good. That's true in all kinds of domains. Makes organizing a lot easier than it was then, and it makes repression a lot harder. That's to the good, and we should bear that in mind. Well, we should also bear in mind that whatever happens here, whether it's the Red Scare, or COINTELPRO, or Patriot 1, or Patriot 2, which I should mention that if Patriot 2 sneaks through, it's going to be a lot worse. Patriot 2 goes way beyond anything that's ever been proposed in any remotely democratic society. It, for example, grants the executive the right to remove citizenship without charge, just on the decision of the Attorney General, who doesn't even have to refer to actions. He just has to, as the text puts it, infer from a pattern of behavior that the person deserves to have his citizenship taken away. Nothing like that's ever been dreamt of in anything that calls itself a democratic society, and it almost went through. My suspicion is they were trying to sneak it through under cover of the Iraq War, more or less the way Patriot 1 was sneaked through, but there was enough resistance, so they had to back off, but we'll hear from it again. Anyway, all of these things, whatever they may be, don't amount to very much as compared with what people face in other societies. And it's important to bear in mind that, including, for example, just to illustrate, just take the society, the countries that are the leaders in receiving U.S. military aid. I'll put aside Israel and Egypt, which are a totally separate category. But outside of Israel and Egypt, right through the 90s, through the liberal period, the Clinton period, and today, the leading recipients of U.S. military aid were Turkey and Colombia. Turkey, because it was carrying out a murderous counterinsurgency campaign against its miserably repressed Kurdish population, with millions of people driven out of their homes, the countryside devastated, tens of thousands of people killed, every barbaric form of torture you can imagine. I've actually visited some of the indescribable slums in Istanbul where refugees are trying to survive in virtually demolished buildings or in the caves of walls in towns in southeastern Turkey. Actually, the latest terrorist activities in Turkey are traced to that region so far, which is possibly true. If you treat people like that long enough, all kind of awful things happen. As the terrorist atrocities, state terror increased, U.S. military aid increased until the point where Turkey became the world leader. In the year 1997 alone, Clinton sent as much military aid to Turkey as the entire Cold War period combined up to the onset of the counterinsurgency campaign. It's pretty brutal. And furthermore, the laws of the country are harsh and brutal as well. But intellectuals there are very different from those in the West, completely different. They not only constantly leading writers, journalists, publishers, artists, academics, not only constantly protest the laws, but are engaged in regular civil disobedience against them, and are facing and sometimes enduring quite severe punishment. The state security courts don't even have a resemblance to courts. I've been in them, in fact. But they do it, and they do it unpretentiously, simply, daily, always at it. That's the kind of thing that people face in the world. The second leading recipient of U.S. military aid, now the first leading one since 1999, is Colombia, by far the worst human rights record in the hemisphere, by far the leading recipient of U.S. military aid during the Clinton years, correlated. By now, it's reached the level of, well, they claim, about 20 political assassinations a day. Again, a huge number of people, well over 1 million, one of the biggest displaced populations in the world, driven off the land into urban slums. A lot of it's done by chemical warfare under the guise of drug eradication, which we have absolutely no right to do in the first place, even if that were the goal, and it's not. And people there are facing really severe dangers, like the danger of political assassination, constant danger, but they keep at it. Again, priests, academics, human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, they're there every day doing the same things. We should bear that in mind when we think about the threats that people are concerned about here. They're not trivial by any means, but by international standards, they don't amount to much. And that's particularly true in the countries where we're responsible for imposing those conditions, which everyone would know about in fact, intellectuals here should be humiliated by the regular behavior of their counterparts in countries like, say, Turkey and Colombia, and they would be humiliated by it if they knew about it. But fortunately, we have a free press, so nobody knows about it. And that's not insignificant. Well, there are other facts that nobody knows about thanks to the free press and the educated community in general, of which the press is a pretty fair representation. So everybody knows George Bush's famous statement that right after 9/11, that we are going to treat any nation that harbors terrorists as a terrorist state, meaning we'll bomb and destroy them. Oddly, Bush was not sent to Guantanamo for making that statement because he was calling for the bombing of the United States, clearly and explicitly. There is not the slightest doubt that the United States harbors terrorists. Incidentally, about 2/3 of the population agrees with Bush that we should bomb the United States. 2/3 of the population believes that we should bomb any country, has a right, any country, not just the United States, has a result to attack a country that is harboring people who are planning or executing terrorist attacks against it. Well, that means quite a long list of countries should be setting off bombs in Washington and New York, according to 2/3 of the population. Who are the terrorists who are harbored here? Well, begin right at the top. The administration is almost entirely recycled from the Reagan and Bush 1 administration. They have the honor to be the only administration in the world that has been condemned by the World Court for international terrorism, again, in their war against Nicaragua, which, of course, they dismissed the court judgment and immediately escalated the war, in fact, officially directing their forces to attack what they called soft targets, undefended civilian targets. Vetoed a Security Council resolution affirming the court judgment and calling on all states to observe international law. And in fact, that's sort of the least of it, but that's one case. So yes, there's terrorists continuing to direct policy, but let's just keep to the people who the FBI and the Justice Department call terrorists, just that category. Are we harboring them? Well, all over the country, in fact. most dramatically, though not only, in Miami, the scene of recent state terror activities, which you probably know about. So take, say, Orlando Bosch, who, according to the FBI and the Justice Department, is responsible for, they identify about 30 terrorist acts, some of them quite severe, like blowing up an airliner and killing 73 people, and a lot of others. The INS was planning to deport him as a threat to the United States. The Justice Department supported that. They said that leaving him allowing him to stay in this country is a threat to the national security of the United States. But they were overruled by George Bush #1, who granted him a presidential pardon at the request of Jeb Bush, governor of Florida. So he's living happily in Miami, which of course gives, and continuing to be involved quite openly in planning of execution of terrorist actions, which have been going on it's now on to 45 years. In the early years, directly run from Washington, especially during the Kennedy administration, more recently run by terrorists who we harbor here, which surely gives Cuba, just as it gives Nicaragua, others, the right to bomb the United States, according to George Bush and 2/3 of the population. The terrorist war against Cuba is not at all trivial. It's quite apart from what it's done to Cubans. It almost led to a nuclear war, came very close. It was a major factor behind the missile crisis. Kennedy renewed the terrorist attacks right after the missile crisis and practically up to the day of his assassination. All of this is pretty serious, and it's continuing. And the aftermath is interesting up till today. I mean, humiliating for us, but interesting. We should know about it. So a couple of years ago, the Cubans decided to try to infiltrate the terrorist organizations in Florida to figure out what they're up to, what their plans are. They do carry out regular, constant attacks. And they did. They got a lot of information. The FBI was invited by the Cuban government to go to Havana. They did. They sent some of their top agents to Havana. I think the second highest person in the FBI went to Havana, where they were provided with detailed information, about 1,000 pages, hours of videotapes and so on planning of terrorist actions in Florida, mainly Miami. And they thanked the Cubans for having given them this information about terrorist acts being organized and implemented from U.S. territory, and they acted on it. A couple of weeks later, they did send people to courts and finally prison, namely the ones who had infiltrated the terrorist organizations. They were brought to trial. The government insisted on trying them in Miami, because in Miami it's a certainty that you can't have a fair trial. You look at the jury, it was all mad anti-Cuban terrorists. The prosecution case was so awful that the judge instructed the jury to disregard it, but they sentenced them anyway, 2 sentenced to life imprisonment, 3 others to long prison sentences. A lot of the time in solitary confinement. The U.S. government won't allow visas for their families to visit them. So for the crime of exposing terrorist actions on U.S. soil, they are now in jail. How many people know about this? Well, Cuba, they certainly know. Latin America, everybody knows. In the United States, nobody knows, except those who are involved in the support committees for the Cuban Five, as they're called. Again, a triumph of the freedom of the press, a particularly ironic case, and in this case, given the fuss about terrorism and the talk about harboring terrorists. Well, we could go on, but instead let's continue to something else, still keeping to the free press. The most serious violations that Churchill condemned are not carried out on home soil, but rather in Guantanamo. That is really a major atrocity and scandal. It's been bitterly condemned all over the world. It was condemned very harshly by the Justice Department's own Inspector General, but of course that was dismissed. Human rights organizations have report after report about it. I won't go on because you can easily find it out if you don't know already, as you should. That's extremely serious. What's that about? Well, the most important aspect is not so much what's happening to the people detained there without charge permanently, so on. That's bad enough. But more serious is another fact, namely, what's the United States doing in Guantanamo? Guantanamo is illegally occupied territory. It's part of Cuba, which the United States simply stole when it conquered Cuba under the guise of liberation in 1898. Technically, Cuba agreed to give the United States a permanent lease to Guantanamo, which is about as valid as the Vichy government giving the rights to the Nazis to a permanent military bases in France when they were under military occupation. But it's considered quite legitimate here. The holding on to Guantanamo means that the U.S. keeps the best port in Cuba and prevents any development in the eastern part of the island. That's part of the effort at economic strangulation of Cuba, which has gone on also for almost 45 years. And that's also been bitterly condemned. Every relevant international forum has condemned it. The only reason the World Trade Organization didn't condemn it is because the U.S. refused to allow a European Union case to be heard. It just walked out, said we're not going to listen to it. So that was the end of that one. Everywhere else it's been condemned. Even the Organization of American States, which is very careful. They don't want to offend the mafia don who runs the hemisphere. It's too dangerous. But in this case, they went as far just a few months ago as refusing to allow the United States to serve on the Human Rights Commission of the OAS. Symbolic, of course, but significant as an indication of the anger about both this and other things like the Cuban Five and more. And that's all over the world the same, except here where nobody knows about it. So virtually nobody here knows, again, you can try a poll, that just 2 weeks ago, I guess, the General Assembly of the United Nations once again condemned the illegal economic warfare, this time by a vote of 179 to 3. The 3 were the United States, Israel, which votes reflexively with the United States, and a Pacific island. There was an abstention. Morocco abstained because although most of the countries of the world, all the countries of the West, condemn Morocco's illegal occupation of the Western Sahara, Cuba is the only country that does so in a principled way, so therefore Morocco abstained in the vote. This was barely mentioned in the United States, just as it is almost always barely mentioned, because we're not supposed to know things like that. We're not supposed to know how the world reacts to illegal U.S. actions